This 1894 portrait of a young girl looks proper until you notice the pin on her dress. At first glance, it seemed like any other Victorian cabinet card, a child in lace and ribbon, seated on a velvet cushion, her hands folded in her lap, the kind of image that fills antique shops by the thousands. But one detail in this photograph would unravel a story that stretched back decades, across state lines, and into a system that respectable families worked very hard to keep invisible. Miriam Oyalaran had been working as a collection specialist at a historical society in coastal Georgia for 11 years when the Ashford donation arrived. It was late October 2019. A law firm handling a dissolved estate had transferred 6 boxes of family papers and photographs, the remnants of a once prominent Savannah family whose last direct heir had died without children. Most estate donations like this contained the predictable mix, daguerreotypes of stern ancestors, property deeds, a few letters tied with ribbon. Miriam had processed dozens of them. She could usually sort a box in an afternoon. The cabinet card caught her attention on the second day. It showed a girl of perhaps 8 or 9 years old, photographed in a studio. The backmark read, Hartwell & Sons Augusta with the year 1894 printed beneath. The child wore a white dress with eyelet trim, a wide sash at the waist, and her dark hair was pulled back with a ribbon. Her expression was carefully neutral, the way children were taught to hold still for long exposures. She looked, in every visible way, like a daughter of the house. But Miriam kept returning to the pin. It was small, positioned just below the child's left collarbone. At first she assumed it was a simple brooch, the kind of decorative accessory girls wore in formal portraits. But under magnification, the shape resolved into something specific, a tiny silver hand, fingers closed around what looked like a sheaf of wheat. The design was not decorative. It was too precise, too deliberately placed. And when Miriam searched the Ashford family papers for any reference to the child in the photograph, she found nothing. No name, no birth record, no mention at all. That absence was the first wrong thing. Miriam had seen plenty of unidentified photographs, families' misplaced names, mislabeled albums, forgot which cousin was which. But this was different. The Ashford papers were meticulous. There were christening announcements, school enrollment forms, vaccination records. Every child born to the family between 1840 and 1920 was documented. The girl in the cabinet card was not among them. She removed the photograph from its cardboard mount, working slowly with a thin spatula to separate the layers without tearing. On the back of the print itself, in faded pencil, someone had written a single word: Posie. Not a surname, not a date, just that. Miriam set the photograph on her light table and sat with it for a long time. She had handled thousands of 19th century images. She knew how to read the visual grammar of Victorian portraiture, the way props and poses signaled class and respectability. This photograph had been staged to look like a family portrait, the velvet cushion, the lace dress, the ribbon in the hair. But the pin did not fit. It was too specific, too strange. And the name on the back, written in pencil rather than ink, suggested someone who was meant to be remembered only partially, remembered enough to keep, but not enough to claim. She began her research the next morning. The Ashford family had been cotton factors in Savannah before the war, middlemen who financed planters and sold their crops. After emancipation, they shifted into banking and insurance. The family papers showed a respectable trajectory: church memberships, charitable donations, a son who served in the state legislature. There was no obvious scandal, no hint of disgrace. But the photograph with its strange pin and its missing name suggested a gap in the story, something that had been quietly set aside. Miriam started with the photographer. Hartwell & Sons had operated a studio in Augusta from 1881 to 1903. A local history blog maintained by a retired librarian had digitized several of their backmarks and noted that the studio primarily served families of means. The 1894 date placed the photograph squarely in the post-Reconstruction era, a time when Georgia's racial order had been brutally reimposed through law and terror. Miriam knew this history in broad strokes, but she needed someone who understood the specific visual codes of that period. She reached out to a professor of American Studies at a university in Atlanta, a scholar named Lorraine Jeffers, whose work focused on photography and race in the 19th century South. Dr. Jeffers agreed to look at a high-resolution scan. Her response came 3 days later, and it changed everything. "The pin," Dr. Jeffers wrote, "is almost certainly a service badge. I have seen similar designs in other photographs from this period, always on children who were not biological members of the family. The hand holding wheat was a common motif for domestic service, particularly in households that employed what were called companion children. These were typically light-skinned black or mixed-race children who were brought into white homes to serve as playmates and attendants for the family's own children. The practice was widespread in the South before the war, and it continued in modified forms well into the 20th century. The children were often given diminutive names: Posie, Mamie, Bertie, names that marked them as ornamental, as belonging to the household without being part of the family. Miriam read the email twice. Then she went back to the Ashford papers and began searching for any reference to household employees, servants, or dependents. What she found was not a name. It was a category. In an 1895 household account ledger, tucked between entries for groceries and coal, there was a quarterly notation: Posie, board and dress, $4.50. The same entry appeared every 3 months through 1899, then stopped. There was no explanation for the payments, no indication of where the money went or why it ended. But the ledger made one thing clear: Posie was not a daughter. She was an expense. Miriam brought her findings to the Historical Society's director, a man named Charles Whitmore, who had run the institution for nearly 2 decades. He listened carefully, examined the photograph, and then asked a question that Miriam had been dreading. "What exactly are you suggesting we do with this?" She did not have a good answer yet, but she knew that the photograph could not simply be filed away with the rest of the Ashford donation, catalogued as "unidentified girl, circa 1894. The image had been staged to make Posie look like a member of the family. That staging was itself a kind of lie, a visual sleight of hand that erased her actual position in the household. To repeat that erasure now, a century later, felt like complicity. Miriam asked for time to continue her research. Whitmore agreed, though he cautioned her that the Society's resources were limited and that she should not let this project consume her other responsibilities. She nodded and said she understood. Then she went back to her office and began searching for Posie in earnest. The trail led first to the 1900 census. The Ashford household that year included the family patriarch, his wife, 3 children, and 2 servants listed by name. Neither servant was named Posie. But in the supplemental schedules, Miriam found something else, a notation that the household had previously included a ward who was no longer present. The census taker had not recorded the ward's name, only her approximate age at departure, which was listed as 14, and her race, which was listed as mulatto. 14 in 1900 meant born around 1886. The photograph was dated 1894. If the girl in the cabinet card was Posie, she would have been roughly 8 years old when it was taken. The timeline fit. Miriam contacted a genealogist who specialized in African American family histories, a woman named Delia Crawford, who operated out of a small office in Macon. Delia had spent decades reconstructing lineages that slavery and segregation had deliberately fragmented. She agreed to search for any trace of a girl named Posie who might have passed through the Ashford household in the 1890s. The search took weeks. Delia worked through county records, church rolls, and the sparse documentation that survived from Georgia's black communities in that era. Most of it led nowhere. But in the records of a small African Methodist Episcopal church in Burke County, about 30 miles from Augusta, she found a burial entry from 1901. The deceased was listed as Posie Ashford, colored, age 15, cause of death consumption. The entry noted that the burial was paid for by the family, with no further specification. Posie had died at 15. She had been buried with the Ashford name attached to her, though no Ashford had ever claimed her as kin. And the family, whoever that meant, had paid for her grave. Miriam and Delia spent the next month piecing together what they could of Posie's short life. The picture that emerged was fragmentary but consistent with patterns that Dr. Jeffers had described. Posie had almost certainly been a companion child, brought into the Ashford household as a young girl to attend the family's daughters. She would have lived in the house, worn cast-off clothes, learned to read and write alongside the children she served. But she would never have been their equal. The pin on her dress marked that difference. It was a badge of service, visible in the photograph to anyone who knew how to read it, invisible to anyone who did not. The practice of keeping companion children had roots in slavery, when enslaved children were often raised alongside their owner's offspring as playmates and body servants. After emancipation, the practice adapted. White families in the South continued to bring black children into their homes, sometimes through informal arrangements with impoverished families, sometimes through more coercive means. The children were rarely paid wages. They were instead given board and dress, as the Ashford Ledger put it, fed and clothed in exchange for their labor. Legally, they occupied a gray zone. They were not enslaved, but they were not free in any meaningful sense either. They could be sent away at any time, for any reason, with no recourse. Dr. Jeffers provided Miriam with additional context. The service badges were part of a broader system of marking, she explained during a phone call. In some households, companion children wore specific colors or styles of dress that distinguished them from the family's own children. In others, they wore pins or brooches that identified their role. The badges served a dual purpose. They reminded the child of her place, and they signaled to visitors that this was not a daughter of the house, despite appearances. It was a way of maintaining racial hierarchy, even when that hierarchy was not immediately visible. The photograph of Posie, in this light, became a document of that system. She had been dressed in white lace and posed on a velvet cushion made to look like a proper Victorian child. But the pin gave her away. It marked her as property in all but name, a child who belonged to the household without belonging to the family. Miriam brought her expanded research to Director Whitmore in January 2020. She proposed that the Historical Society create an interpretive display around the photograph, using it as a case study in the hidden labor systems that persisted in the South after emancipation. She had prepared a folder of supporting documents, the ledger entries, the census records, the burial notation, and Dr. Jeffers's scholarly analysis. She believed the story was solid, well-documented, and important. Whitmore's response was cautious. The Ashfords were significant donors to this institution, he said. Not recently, but historically. Their name is on the reading room. Miriam had not known this. She looked at the folder in her hands and felt something shift. That does not change what the photograph shows, she said. No, Whitmore agreed, but it complicates how we present it. We have board members who are sensitive to these issues. We have relationships to maintain. The meeting ended without resolution. Whitmore said he would consult with the board's executive committee and get back to her. Miriam returned to her office and sat for a long time with the cabinet card on her desk, the girl with the pin staring back at her with that careful, neutral expression. The board meeting took place in early February. Miriam was not invited to attend, but she submitted a written summary of her findings and a proposed exhibition outline. The outline was modest. A single display case in the Society's permanent gallery, featuring the photograph alongside contextual materials about companion children and post-emancipation labor. She estimated the cost at less than $2,000. The board's response came a week later, delivered by Whitmore in person. The executive committee had decided that the photograph was too speculative to feature in a permanent display. They acknowledged that Miriam's research was thorough, but they felt that the interpretive claims went beyond what the evidence could support. The photograph would be cataloged and made available to researchers, but it would not be exhibited publicly. Miriam asked if she could speak to the committee directly. Whitmore said that would not be appropriate. She considered her options. She could accept the decision and move on. She could resign in protest, though that seemed both dramatic and ineffective. Or she could find another way to tell Posie's story. In March, she contacted a journalist who covered Southern history for a regional magazine. His name was Jerome Tillman, and he had written extensively about the legacy of slavery and segregation in Georgia. Miriam sent him her research, explained the institutional resistance she had encountered, and asked if he thought there was a story worth telling. Jerome called her the next day. He was interested, but he wanted to go further than a single photograph. "This is not just about one girl," he said. "This is about a system. If we can find other examples, other photographs with similar badges, we can show that this was not an anomaly. It was a practice." Over the next several months, working mostly in their spare time, Miriam and Jerome searched for additional evidence. Dr. Jeffers connected them with other scholars and collectors. Delia Crawford continued her genealogical work, tracing the families of other companion children whose names appeared in scattered records. By summer, they had assembled a small archive, 5 photographs from different households across Georgia and South Carolina, each showing a child with a similar service badge. In 2 cases, they were able to identify the children by name and trace their subsequent lives. One had died young, like Posie. The other had survived into adulthood, married, and had children of her own, though she never spoke publicly about her years in the White household. The article was published in September 2020. It was titled, "The Children Who Belonged to the House," and it used the Ashford photograph as its central image. Jerome had written the text. Miriam was credited as a contributing researcher. The piece generated modest attention at first, shared among historians and activists who recognized its significance. Then a larger outlet picked it up, and the story began to spread. The Historical Society received inquiries. Some were supportive, praising the institution for preserving such important materials. Others were critical, asking why the photograph had not been exhibited and why it had taken an outside journalist to tell the story. Director Whitmore issued a brief statement acknowledging Miriam's research and announcing that the Society would review its interpretive practices. He did not mention the board's earlier decision to suppress the display. In November, a woman named Arlene Suggs contacted the Historical Society. She was 73 years old, a retired schoolteacher living in Atlanta, and she had seen the article about the photograph. She believed that Posie was her great-great-aunt. Miriam met her at the Society's research room on a Tuesday afternoon. Arlene brought a folder of her own, birth certificates, family Bibles, a single faded photograph of a woman she said was her great-grandmother, Posie's younger sister. The family story, passed down through generations, held that Posie had been taken by a white family when she was very young and had never come home. Her sister had mourned her for the rest of her life. Miriam showed Arlene the cabinet card. The old woman studied it for a long time, her fingers trembling slightly as she held the edges. "She looks so proper," Arlene said finally. "Like she was their daughter, but she was not, was she?" It was not a question. They sat together in the research room as Miriam walked her through the documentation, the ledger entries, the census records, the burial notation. Arlene listened carefully, asking occasional questions, her expression shifting between grief and a kind of grim recognition. "My grandmother always said they treated her like family," Arlene said. "That was how they told it. Like it was a kindness, taking in a poor-colored child and giving her a home. But a home is not the same as a family, is it? A home can be taken away." Before she left, Arlene asked if the Historical Society would consider lending the photograph for a family memorial service. Miriam said she would ask. This time, Whitmore approved the request without hesitation. The service was held the following spring at the AME Church in Burke County, where Posie had been buried more than a century earlier. The congregation was small, perhaps 30 people, most of them descendants of Posie's extended family. The photograph was displayed on an easel near the altar, alongside a printed summary of her life. Arlene spoke briefly about what it meant to finally see her ancestor's face, to know her name, to understand what had been done to her. "She was a child," Arlene said. "She did not choose any of this, but she survived as long as she could. And now we are here to say her name and remember her. Posie, our Posie." After the service, Miriam stood in the churchyard near the small stone that marked Posie's grave. It had been placed by the Ashford family in 1901, and it bore only her first name and the years of her birth and death. No surname, no epitaph, just the bare facts of a life that had been carefully, deliberately minimized. The Historical Society eventually agreed to create a permanent display around the photograph. It opened in the fall of 2021, 2 years after Miriam first noticed the pin on Posie's dress. The display included the cabinet card, reproductions of the supporting documents, and a short video featuring interviews with Dr. Jeffers, Delia Crawford, and Arlene Suggs. It was titled, "Belonging Without Belonging, Companion Children in the Post-Emancipation South." The exhibition text did not accuse the Ashford family of cruelty. It did not need to. The documents spoke clearly enough. They showed a household that had taken a child from her family, dressed her in lace, photographed her like a daughter, and then recorded her upkeep as a line item in an account book. When she died at 15, they paid for her burial and gave her their name, the only inheritance they were willing to provide. Director Whitmore retired the following year. His successor, a younger woman with a background in public history, made a point of highlighting the Posie display in her first public remarks. She said it represented the kind of work the institution should be doing, using its collections not to preserve comfortable myths, but to uncover the truths that those myths were designed to hide. Miriam still works at the Historical Society. She still processes estate donations, sorts through boxes of photographs and papers, catalogs the remnants of families who no longer exist. Most of the time the work is routine, but occasionally she finds something that makes her stop. A name that does not appear in the family tree. A face that does not quite fit. A detail in the background or the foreground that suggests a story no one wanted told. She knows now what to look for. The pins, the badges, the subtle markers of status and servitude, the careful staging that made exploitation look like affection. The photographic conventions of the 19th century were designed to project respectability, to show families as they wished to be seen. But the camera captured more than its subjects intended. It recorded the positions of hands, the angles of bodies, the small objects that signified roles and relationships. For those who know how to read them, these photographs are not just portraits. They are evidence. Posie's photograph hangs in a climate-controlled case in a gallery that bears the Ashford name. Visitors pass it on their way to exhibits about cotton and commerce, war and Reconstruction. Some pause to read the label. Some look closely at the girl in the white dress. Her dark hair pulled back, her hands folded, the small silver pin below her collarbone. Most do not notice the pin at all, but it is there. It has always been there. A hand clutching wheat, the symbol of a child who worked in a house that was never her home, who wore a dress that was never her own, who was photographed like a daughter and buried with a borrowed name. For more than a century, the photograph told a lie about who she was. Now, finally, it tells the truth. Thousands of similar photographs survive in archives and antique shops across the South. Cabinet cards and tintypes and albumin prints, images of children posed in borrowed finery, their status marked by details too small for casual viewers to notice. Each of these photographs contains a buried story. Each of these children had a name, a family, a life that was interrupted and reshaped by forces beyond their control. Most of those stories will never be recovered. The records are too sparse, the connections too fragile, the years too many. But some stories can still be found. They wait in the margins of account books, in the burial rolls of small country churches, in the faded pencil notations on the backs of photographs. They wait for someone to look closely, to ask the right questions, to refuse the comfortable assumption that an old portrait is just an old portrait. Posie waited 125 years. She is not waiting anymore.